America! Can't you see what's happening? We're selling out to foreigners. They're taking over everything. Wealth-producing companies, the best the world has known. We've sold more than 8,000 of them in 10 years alone.
Welcome to Public Affairs with Economy in Crisis. I'm Nathan White.
And I'm Craig Harrington.
Today we're going to be talking about NAFTA. Craig, a lot of people say they know what NAFTA is. It's the North American Free Trade Agreement. But what is it really? And I'd like for you to talk about a little bit about its history and what it's done, especially for the U.S. When we initially entered into NAFTA, we thought that there were going to be a lot of advantages. But it turns out there are a lot more cons than pros.
Absolutely.
For the U.S. being in NAFTA. And not only that, but it seems like even for Mexico as well. Hasn't really helped them out too much. Can you tell us a little bit about the history and then its implications for the U.S.?
Well, the North American Free Trade Agreement was initially pushed by President George Herbert Walker Bush. It wasn't signed into law until December 1993 by President Clinton, and it came into effect on January 1st, 1994, during the Clinton administration's first term. But the idea of the North American Free Trade Agreement dates all the way back to the 1980s. Essentially, the intent of the North American Free Trade Agreement, like all free trade agreements, is to increase the volume of trade, to lower barriers to trade, and to therefore increase the quality of life. Unfortunately, the volume of trade and the quality of life don't go hand in hand. That's one of the things we've seen with NAFTA, with the Central American Free Trade Agreement, the Andean Free Trade Agreement, regional free trade agreements all around the world, and the WTO, which is the overarching free trade association. What we've seen with NAFTA particularly was what Ross Perot called the great sucking sound. And we feared that it would take jobs from the United States and send them to where it was cheaper, Mexico. And it's done just that. So while there have been a few advantages to NAFTA, there have been some jobs created, and there has been a significant increase in free trade. The disadvantages are too many to count in some places. Unfortunately, one of the reasons that we formed NAFTA was to increase the standard of living in Mexico, and what we haven't seen in the last 14 and a half years is any increase in the standard of living in Mexico. Essentially, free trade creates billionaires and poverty. And Mexico now has more billionaires than it ever had in its history, but it also has more poverty than it's ever had as well. So the volume of free trade hasn't really been as indicative of increased standard of living as we had hoped.
Now, back in the Industrial Revolution, we saw a lot of cities basically explode in Europe. Take Manchester, for instance. It was basically the very first one that just exploded, and you saw people, the living conditions becoming terrible. People were living on top of each other. Crime was terrible. Sanitation was terrible. My understanding with NAFTA now is that these same kind of effects have happened in Mexico. Some of the cities where all of this production has gone to, and all of this trade has gone to, have become full of crime and just terrible cities.
Absolutely. Mexico was hardly a walk in the park before NAFTA was created. Mexico City has always been overcrowded. The coastal cities have always been wrought with crime. But one of the intentions of NAFTA was when you increase trade, you increase the amount of money that people have in their pockets. When you increase disposable income, you increase standard of living, and you encourage people to get jobs and to not pursue deviant activities. Unfortunately, the coastal cities in Mexico are just as crime-ridden as they always have been. The major port cities that have these imports coming to and from, they're still the somewhat squalid conditions that they were 20, 30, 40 years ago. And unfortunately, things have just gotten worse for many Mexicans, millions and millions of them. At the same time, things have gotten worse for millions and millions of Americans. Part of NAFTA was the opening of borders and the liberalization of trade. And what we saw was the manufacturing sector of the United States was exported to the north, to Canada, and to the south with Mexico. Ford now produces thousands and thousands of vehicles in Mexico every year and drives them across the border. And since there's no tariff, there's no excise tax, there's no border tax of any kind, it's actually cheaper for Ford to produce in Mexico because Mexican laborers make 1/10 or 1/20 of what American laborers would make to make the same vehicles. Similarly in Canada, General Motors has thousands of employees in Canada. And the standard of living in Canada is roughly similar to the United States, but it is still significantly cheaper when you draw it out over a long period of time. So what we had was what H. Ross Perot coined the giant sucking sound. He said in 1992, when he was running for president, that NAFTA and organizations like it would take jobs out of the United States and send them to the cheapest possible bidder. And people didn't believe that. People thought free trade was this great thing. People thought free trade was going to save the world.
How can it really be a great thing when it's exploiting people in other countries?
Absolutely. There are a lot of contentions regarding NAFTA and regarding free trade in general, and one of them is exploitation, and free trade in some ways absolutely is exploitation. The United States has been hurt a lot by NAFTA, by the WTO, by other free trade agreements, but at the same time, the elites in the United States have also hurt a lot of people in the countries that they've gone to. Multinational corporations that are based here in the U.S. have reaped huge profits since free trade liberalization began really 50 years ago. And at the same time, they were bringing in these profits. They weren't really helping the people that they were employing. They were just exploiting them. And yeah, they had a job, and yeah, they had a stable income. But on $1 a day, they may be making more than someone else in that country, but they're not making anywhere near what they would be making in the United States. It's sheer exploitation in some degree.
Yeah, we've seen in states like New York where they tried to pass a bill to where illegals could actually get driver's license. We're seeing the border fence going up, which is in response to the war on terrorism, to secure our borders, but also because we just have so many people flooding over from Mexico, especially. It's obvious that NAFTA is not working in the best interest for Mexico, Canada, or for the United States.